me to use the museums more as, and so I should probably talk to like AAM too and say like, how can we cross over in other museums? I know lots of museum people from other museums, like my counterparts come to the class and I go to theirs. But I didn't think about it sending it into the museum. So very smart staff. And I think you had a question though, go right ahead.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to be sure I understood the run of show. So Jeff is joining us, and
Jeff he'll be here.
Questions, as I know
he's probably going to ask you about who are the 10 women we should know.
Oh gosh, I get 10. Yeah. That's amazing.
Oh, I said 10, but like you can do as many or as few as you want. We love the Friday classes to be, I always love that the students get to meet real historians and get a perspective into like a little snapshot of what college can be like, or what, a snapshot of talking to historians like. But at the same time, we always love the stories that you all are researching and the stories of your experience as well. So I was just chatting with him. We're developing a course on the Constitution and we were just talking about it. And he's like, top 10 great people. I'm like, yeah, let's do the top 10 women.
I love it.
Yeah. So but we're pretty loose. My joke is that this is like in the actor's studio, but for history class. And that totally
I don't get to be that moody and weird though, do I? That.
Oh, I never. Yes, you can be totally fickle. You could be like dramatically.
Yeah.
Hi, Corey. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know the stream is live and I'm going to give back host to you.
Cool. Thank you, Sophie. Have a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sophie's our head of social media, and also, thank goodness, is live streaming, because that is like the skill I can't do. I can't click on live stream correctly. I was like, okay, that's my skill, and I'm out. Okay, so I'm back to being host. Move her over. Okay, everybody, 5 minutes before we get started, we're going to be talking about the 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote, with Professor Jones today. So we're super excited, as you can tell, as you come in. And students coming in, feel free to share in the chat where you're coming from in the country or outside of the country, because I know we have international people as well. And also, if you are a classroom, what grade you're in. So it's great to hear like 10th grade from Arizona, whatever you want. Feel free to share it in the chat. So welcome, everybody. Nice. Good modeling there, Professor Jones.
Well, I'm excited to be here. So it's, some days I'm just sitting at my house and that's not as interesting, but today I'm in a good place.
So you got to do, so we have a little, we call it the lodge above my garage, but the trick is that you got to can you see the roller skates? Where are they? Behind me?
Oh, I can't see them. Oh, yeah.
They're back there by the chair. You got to get roller skates. So when you're at home, you roller skate around. It's a very, very fun thing to keep you moving during the workday at home.
Well, I mean, I think it's a real question for a lot of us. We've seen a lot more of one another's homes and personal lives than we ever imagined we would. And I have to interview somebody tomorrow, and I thought, I wonder if I'm allowed to make reference to that, right? In other words, I noticed, in your home office, you have X, Y, or we're supposed to pretend like we didn't really see behind the curtain. So, but I know students and teachers have seen, oh, there's Jennifer Welsh. Hey, Jennifer. That we've seen a different side of one another in these couple of years. So
I have to be honest, I feel like it's no holds bar for me behind what's behind you. Because it was Theodore Shaw was on a few weeks ago, and his bookshelf was like stack, and I was like zooming in during class.
That's it. I love to look at people's bookshelves. And these are actually
favorite.
These are my home bookshelves. And this is a false background, which you can tell when I move around. And but I was really tired of looking at like my real background. So I decided I would experiment with some, false backgrounds that I liked. So yeah, professor's bookshelves for sure. Yeah.
Yes, you're right. There should just be like a website that lets you like scroll through everybody's bookshelf, and like it's like an Instagram page that it's just professor's bookshelf. It would be so cool. We wound up talking about it for like 10 minutes because I was dying to know what was on his shelf. And then he started pulling books down and I'm like, oh, here we
that's
go.
Nice. Well, in my office, actually, it's the stack of books here that tells you everything you need to know about what I'm doing, right? These are the books that are literally on my desk and nobody can see them, but I can see them. And there's a story there about what I've been doing all morning, at least.
I think that's actually really interesting too. Like not just what's on the shelf, but what's on the ones you're working with, which I was like this one, I was like diving into this one again. And we were talking about it like 2 weeks in class. I'm like, oh, right here. I felt very on point. But that's the boys one, I feel like is one I like circle back around constantly. So it never gets too far for me. So this is exciting. So we've got lots of students from New Jersey, both 7th grade and 10th grade. Hey, everybody from New Jersey. Jennifer Gilder, in the Gilder Lehrman classes, we want to make a coffee table of our professor's bookshelf. I love that, Jennifer. That's a great idea. So everybody, welcome. We'll get started in 1 minute. Jeff should be here any minute now. I realize we're running out of time. As you guys all come in, please feel free to share where you're coming from in the nation, what grade you're in, if you're a lifelong learner. All those things are wonderful. And make sure Jeff has the link because that sometimes happens too. We will get started. Awesome. I'm going to do what I'm going to do because we can get started as Jeff is coming in. I'm going to resume recording and go through your bio, and then we can keep moving as we go.
Superb.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. So excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sautner, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. I have a really fun job and a really great job. We get to do all these fun educational things all the time. And this is every Friday, we get to welcome a different scholar to our classes to talk about the theme of the week. This week's theme is all about the 19th Amendment and the women's right to vote. So what a perfect week. It's connected to the International Women's Week, but it's also March, which is Women's History Month. Not that we should not be celebrating amazing women in history every single day, but this month we're definitely putting a spotlight and a focus on it and talking about the 19th Amendment and women who made history. So today's VIP guest is Professor Jones. Now, Professor Jones, I was diving through your bio before we started class. It's so much fun to have you. You have like 5 different professorships, but you're a professor of history and you're at Johns Hopkins University. So I would love for you to kind of, say hi to the students, join in, but also tell us a little bit about your work and the work that you do at Johns Hopkins and the series that you do with hard history. Before we dive into the 19th Amendment, I'd love to know a little bit more about your career, why you went into history and the law, because you also have a degree in the law, and the hard history series out of Johns Hopkins University. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and welcome everybody. It's terrific to be here with you. I'll just take a couple of minutes to say that you don't have enough time for my whole life story, Carrie, but it is true that once upon a time I was a lawyer, a public interest lawyer in New York. I became a historian because I really wanted to understand the deep backstory. I really wanted to understand how history had brought us to the kinds of issues that came up in my law practice on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the 1980s and 1990s. I got hooked on history in part because I was a family historian and I loved genealogy. And so my work always is combining all of those things, a concern about the public interest with questions about my own family. And my work on the 19th Amendment is really, in a lot of ways, no exception to that. And I hope we'll get to talk about it. I guess the other thing I'll say about my life today, in addition to teaching history at Johns Hopkins, is that I direct a project called Hard Histories at Hopkins. This is a project that really came on me out of nowhere. It wasn't my plan, but my university, a couple of years ago now, learned that our founder and our namesake, Johns Hopkins, who we had for a long time celebrated as an abolitionist and a Quaker, turned out to be a slaveholder as well. And this began for us a kind of introspection, a self-examination as an institution, and some rethinking of the kind of myths we tell about our story. So I work with students in a lab, and they do really exciting research into the history of the university, its relationship to Baltimore, its relationship to the nation, looking to challenge some of the myths that we've long told about ourselves and replace them with good history. And I couldn't do that without the students who come on board every semester and roll up their sleeves and dig into the archives and are really discovering new stories that we didn't know about ourselves. It's really, really fun.
I think that is so important for our students to understand, where you came on this and then where your students are working, because it begins with asking questions about, well, what is the backstory? And so I never knew you came into this as a family genealogist. And that is so important, because that's the best way to start your research. You can start it at home. You can start it with family members. You can start it with friends. And then this is the same work that your students are doing at Johns Hopkins. So students, you can start being a historian right now if you haven't already, but it's a great way to understand, how do we tell the whole story of our past and really dive into what you said is the real history around that. So hi, Jeff Rosen. So nice to have you join us. And we just kicked off with a little bit about Professor Jones' background, what got her excited about being in history, the work she's doing at Johns Hopkins. And I'll turn it over to you to kick off the 19th Amendment.
Thank you so much. Professor Jones, it's so wonderful to see you. It's always such an honor to have you with our great NCC students, and welcome to our Friday class.
Thanks so much for having me.
There's so much to talk about, but we've had such meaningful conversations in the past when I've asked you just to tell us about some of the heroic women who have been crucial in fighting for constitutional change in America. And in your pathbreaking book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, you list a series of great women, from Nancy Bell Graves to Susan Davis to Elizabeth Freeman to Quock Walker to Dorena Lee. We could run through those, or I could just ask you, I think I'm going to ask you something else. Just maybe you could just share with our great students the 10 women that you want us to know about when we think about understanding Women's History Month and the 19th Amendment. So I'll let you begin wherever you want and lead us up through the great pantheon of heroic women in the Constitution.
That is so generous that you gave me 10. And maybe a way to enter in is to talk about a controversy that surfaced back in 2018, 2019. Students may know in 2020, we marked 100 years since ratification of the 19th Amendment, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. Back in 1920, that amendment becomes part of the Constitution. So the question was, as we were approaching 2020, 100 years, is how are we going to celebrate that? How are we going to mark that occasion? And one of the proposals, an important one, was that in New York City's Central Park, there would be a monument installed to honor the early leaders of this long struggle for women's voting rights in the United States. And a friend of mine sent me a news clipping, a link, knowing that I'd be interested in this history. But he also knew that I would be a little unsettled. And here I'll tell you why. Because on that monument, they didn't anticipate 10 women, only 2. And the 2 were 2 important New Yorkers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony, longtime collaborators essential figures in the long story of how women get to voting rights in 1920, both upstate New York folks who were going to be on this monument. And I was someone who said, wait a minute, it's 2020 and two women just aren't going to do it, right? It isn't enough to tell this story through Stanton and Anthony, even as they are figures of great consequence. In 2020, we know that the story was more complicated than that. So in that moment, I advocated, as did others, that the monument be amended to include a third figure, and that was Sojourner Truth, another New Yorker of the same generation as Stanton and Anthony, another great advocate for women's rights and women's political power, someone who actually is on the national women's rights stage before either Stanton or Anthony. After a lot of public comment and a lot of reflection, the monument was revised. And now when you visit Central Park, I haven't actually seen it yet myself, COVID, but I will. And when you all visit, you'll know the backstory, right? And it's a great way for us to appreciate how 2, 3, 5, 10, it is hard to capture, right? The complexity, the diversity, the length and the span of this movement in too few women. In the state of Minnesota, they've done 3 monuments to women's suffrage. And every time they do it, the number of women on the monument grows. They started with 3, 5. The last one, I think, was 7. But it's a great way to think about how history works, which is to say, as historians, as we dig in the archives, as we ask new questions, as we look at our own families and our own communities, what we need to say, what we know, and including what we know about the history of the 19th Amendment is always expanding. I think we need holograms or video installations. Now, you all know this at your museum, right? That anything you put in brick or bronze is hard to change and hard to expand on. But I think that's exactly where we are in this story, is appreciating how it is important that the story continue to grow and expand and include more American women all the time. So I didn't actually give you 10, but I'd be happy to come back if you want more names.
Well, that's just wonderful to remind us of the crucial importance of widening the lens, and adding Sojourner Truth to that monument in New York was so important. And I'm eager to ask you for names just because the stories are so compelling, understanding the history through stories. And we could certainly ask for more names about the 19th Amendment, which I will do in a moment, but I am just moved because I know you're writing so powerfully about Abigail Adams, to go back to the beginning, to go back to the founding era and highlight some of the great women who laid the groundwork for women's suffrage. And I've just been reading the remarkable correspondence between Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren about the education of women, and learned that in that famous letter where Abigail says to John, remember the ladies when you're constructing the new government, he blows her off and dismissively says, don't waste my time. And she sort of complains to Mercy Otis Warren and says he was very glib, and I'm going to press this point. But then John comes around, and all 3 of them agree on the crucial importance of the education of women. And Abigail says, yes, if we're going to have learned men, we must have learned women. And John agrees enthusiastically. So tell us about that dynamic. I just thought it was so fascinating about Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren on education.
Yeah, it's so important. And I'll offer another name, and it's Eliza Harriet. I just spent an afternoon with historian Mary Bilder from Boston College, who has a brand new book out called Female Genius. And it is about the moment of the Constitution. And she tells the story of the framing of the Constitution from the perspective of a woman, Eliza Harriet, who is in Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention, giving lectures about what? about female education, right? About women's competence and their capacities as thinkers, as citizens, as constitutional subjects. Among those who attend her lectures is none other than George Washington. And Builder really opens our eyes to the ways in which women are present at that critical founding moment of the framers' conventions, that ideas about women are on the minds of the folks who are carefully crafting the language of the Constitution. And it goes directly to your point, because what Harriet's life project becomes is the establishment of schools for girls and for women, right? That to be educated is to evidence, right, one's capacity for full citizenship, right? One's full standing as a constitutional subject. And so Harriet will give lectures, she will correspond with Washington, importantly, but her real project, right, is getting girls and women to the classroom and preparing them in ways that are analogous in many ways to the ways in which young men are being prepared. Mary Builder believes that this is important in even understanding the language of the Constitution, much of it as gender neutral, and leaving room for the possibility of women as subjects, as voters, as office holders, and more. So we are always learning, and you won't forget the title of that book because it's Female Genius. And I think it's a wonderful book, and it's a great title, and it's a really important story.
I can't wait. Thank you so much for that recommendation. I'm so glad I asked. And I'll just note also how incredibly impressed I was to learn about another female genius, and that was Phyllis Wheatley, the great, the first published African-American poet, formerly enslaved, celebrated as the poetical genius of the Revolution by John Adams, celebrated by George Washington, who treated her respectfully, and the toast of London. Professor Gates calls her the Oprah of her day, so she was really a celebrity. Tell us about her and other figures, great artistic figures about founding era, who she calls to mind.
I'm so glad you mentioned Phyllis Wheatley. Yes, a captive from West Africa, as best we know, brought to Boston as a child, purchased into a home there, where Phyllis Wheatley not only learns to read and to write, but becomes evidence of female genius, right? Of female competence in the late 18th century. And she is prolific as a poet, and as you say, goes on to enjoy recognition and success, not only in the US, but in Britain as well. What's important about Phyllis Wheatley for our subject, the 19th Amendment, is that for African-American women suffragists, Wheatley is always a touchstone. In my book, Vanguard, I tell the story of 1920. So now here we are in the 20th century. The 19th Amendment has become part of the Constitution. And in the city of St. Louis in Missouri, Black women are anticipating that state laws and intimidation and even violence might keep them away from the polls. And they need a strategy for how to overcome that. Well, they organize in their local YWCA, which is called the Phyllis Wheatley branch, which is to say there in the 20th century, Black women suffragists are gathering in the name of Phyllis Wheatley now to run a suffrage school, to teach one another how to pay poll taxes, how to pass literacy tests, even how to face off with hostile registrars. So Wheatley's story, her record, lives on literally in the lives and the work of Black suffragists into the 20th century. The great Black suffragists, one of the most strident among them in the campaign for the 19th Amendment is Washington, D.C.'s Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell is an educator, an education activist who is also the president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the premier suffrage organization founded by Black women. What does she name her daughter? Phyllis. Why? Because she is still pulling on that long record that Phyllis Wheatley has left for American women, and honoring it, but being inspired by it, right? And making it do work even in the 20th century. The story about naming and how Black women use naming as a way of bringing the past into the present, honoring those who have come before, is a really powerful one. And Phyllis Wheatley is right up there at the top of figures who continue to be remembered.
That's extraordinarily moving. It's so powerful to learn that the legacy of Phyllis Wheatley was kept alive in that act of naming. And I'm also so struck by the fact that you just told us that Mary Church Terrell was an education activist, as of course you told us was Eliza Harriet. Is this theme of education linked to the fight for voting throughout American history? And maybe tell us about other figures in the 19th century who fought both for education for women and for women's suffrage.
Yeah, this is so important, for many American women. The role of educator, of teacher, and I know there are teachers on our call today as well as students. The role of teacher is and the work of education is one of the few respectable places where American women can go and to ply a vocation, right? Beyond domestic labor, beyond brutal manual labor, particularly for African-American women, teaching is going to be that place to which they go. Now, I wish that I could be a fly on the wall in some of those classrooms, because these are women who, yes, are teaching all the lessons, right, of the day, as they must, but they are also using the classroom to educate young people, and in particularly girls, right, into a new sense of themselves as members of the body politic, right, as agents of their own political destinies. I tell the story in the 1830s of Susan Paul in Boston, who is an educator there, but turns her students into a mighty band of abolitionists. They develop a performance repertoire. They travel New England, looking to bring Americans into the anti-slavery cause. Imagine that as part of a classroom experience. On the other end of the story, in the 20th century, there's someone like Mary McLeod Bethune, who founds her own girls' school in Daytona, Florida, and will be a voting rights organizer among African-American women in those critical moments around 1920. Mrs. Bethune's school will become a target of the Ku Klux Klan in 1920, when the Klan looks to suppress Black votes. So schools are not always easy places, right? Precisely because they are perceived to be places where ideas are being passed on, ideas are being promoted, where new citizens are being born and educated. They also are the places targeted by those who would suppress voting rights. I hope you all hear the echoes of our own time and the ways in which our schools once again are being subject to scrutiny. Our educators are being surveilled. That education is fundamental, but it is oftentimes in our history controversial. And this was certainly true for the schools that suffragists taught in, that people understood the power of those classrooms, and not everyone welcomed it.
Thank you so much for reminding us of those resonances. And we also have some sincere thanks to you from Serene Williams, who says, I'm an AP government and a push teacher. I reference the book Vanguard with Professor Jones in my classes all the time. Thank you for your incredible research and for telling a more complete story of the women's suffrage movement. When it comes to education, of course, there were unique barriers imposed on African-American men and women, and it was a crime in some states to teach African-Americans to read or to exchange books in the mail. And the fight for education and the vote for African-American men and women in particular was especially arduous. Are there any figures you'd like to highlight when it comes to that struggle?
Absolutely. One of my favorite figures in Vanguard is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And I suspect maybe we've talked about her before, but I talk about her anytime. Born in Baltimore in Maryland before the Civil War, an educator, a poet, ultimately a novelist, an anti-slavery lecturer, a suffragist. But one of the things we know about Frances Harper is that she is born and educated in the slave state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore. And there is no future for her as an educator in Maryland in those years before the Civil War. And so she will have to leave Maryland and head to Pennsylvania, a state that has abolished slavery, a state where it is legal and possible to educate African Americans. So you have that kind of movement, right? A young woman educator who leaves out of the South to become her full self in a state like Pennsylvania. During the Civil War, you have the example of another suffragist, Charlotte Forten. She becomes Charlotte Forten Grimke, a native Philadelphian, a young woman teacher in Salem, Massachusetts during the Civil War, who, as the war conditions permit now, missionaries and teachers to migrate south to work with freed people, even during the war, Charlotte Forten will head to the Sea Islands of South Carolina and begin to work with freed people who, for the very first time, are having the opportunity to learn. One of the stories I love about her time on the Sea Islands that she recounts in her diary, and her diary is a wonderful primary source for classroom teaching, because a lot of us relate to keeping that diary every day, as she did for many, many years, in extraordinary years. But one of the stories she tells is about how there on the Sea Islands during a Thanksgiving Day celebration, the gathering of formerly enslaved people meet their first full-fledged woman suffragist, Frances Dana Gage, who gives welcome remarks. And Charlotte Forten says, I'm not sure what exactly folks were thinking when they encountered, perhaps for the first time, right, a woman at the podium, a woman speaking about politics, a woman speaking about rights. But you see, once again, how education is not simply about what's in the books, right? It's also about these spaces adjacent to the classroom, like a public gathering on Thanksgiving Day, where the suffragists appear and provide another kind of political education for Charlotte Forten's students. It's an amazing scene, but it's one where we realize that the mix is very potent in many of these classrooms. Yes, the lessons in the reading and the writing and the arithmetic, and also the lessons in the politics of the day, including women's rights.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm so reluctant to turn the mic back to Curry, because these conversations are always so incredibly meaningful. But I think my last broad question to you is to tell us about the evolution of women's higher education in the 20th century, even after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Few positions were open to women in politics. and women's colleges, to the degree where they existed, were largely sex segregated. There were different curricula for men and women. Was there an important connection between the meaningful growth of women's political rights and increased access to higher education?
Yes, and I'll share one short anecdote, and it is about a historically Black women's college in the city of Greensboro in North Carolina, Bennett College. Bennett College is reorganized into a women's college in 1926, just 6 years after the 19th Amendment has been ratified. Now, young Black women are coming to the city of Greensboro for a liberal arts education and to be prepared for public life. By the 1950s and the advent of the Civil Rights Movement, the advent of the campaign for the Voting Rights Act, which will ultimately bring many more Black American women to the polls than ever had been able to get there before, the young women of Bennett College are among those activists in Greensboro, participating in Operation Door Knock, going from door to door, making sure that Black folks in Greensboro are registered to vote, that they get to the polls on election day, that their ballots are counted. And so we can see the continuity, right, between that turning point of the 19th Amendment. There are disappointments for Black women because too many of them are not yet able to actually cast ballots, the establishment of a women's college, and ultimately the training up of young women who are going to be the foot soldiers in that campaign that wins the Voting Rights Act. I think those connections are literal and very important.
Superb. I can't resist before Curry takes over to ask, in addition to your wonderful books, both the ones that have been written and the ones that are to come, and you have some very important work that ahead, are there any book recommendations on the subjects that we've been talking about that you'd like to share with our listeners, in addition to that great suggestion by Mary Builder, A Female Genius?
Yes, I want to highlight Kathleen Cahill's book from 2020, which is Recasting the Ballot, which is a look across the broad diversity of American women in this critical moment of the 19th Amendment. So yes, white American women, Black American women, but Latinx women, Asian American women, Native American women are all part of Cahill's story. And she really lets us see this from these many vantage points. I want to shout out from Yvette Dion, a book called Lifting as We Climb, which is, I think, the closest we have to a young adult version of my book, Vanguard. And so for those of you who have young siblings at home and you want to bring them into these lessons, Vanguard might be pitched a little too advanced for them. Not for the 10th graders. I think it works really well there. But for your younger siblings, Yvette Dion's Lifting as We Climb is important. There are 2 new biographies out of Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the civil rights era's great champions of voting rights from Mississippi. One of them from Kate Larson and the other from historian Keisha Blaine. So Fannie Lou Hamer is getting her moment in the sun. And if I'm not mistaken, there's also a new documentary that's just been released about Mrs. Hamer's life and work. So there's no shortage of wonderful new materials, a lot of it inspired by this anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020. And it all promises that we can keep teaching these subjects for a very long time.
Wonderful. I'm so glad I asked. Thank you for those inspiring book recommendations. Friends, we are posting them in the chat, and read the books that Professor Jones has suggested, and you will expand your universe and learn so much. And with that, Curry, take it away.
And I'm in complete agreement with Linda in the chat that thank you for bringing up Hamer, because we love to talk about her. That's great, the 2 new books to share. And students, we will share out with you the entire list of books. So if you missed it, don't worry, we got you covered. So a question that Colin had earlier in the class, he wanted to know, is there somebody, when we're thinking about how we engage with the world and women's rights, and voting, is there somebody from the past that we can really look to the lessons that they pushed in the past that are really reflective today? One person that you might kind of say, it might be way more than one person, but one person you say, this still is a challenge for us today, and this is who we should learn about and see how we can take action.
Yeah, well, I'll point us to the great Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida Wells is well remembered, importantly so, as having been a cutting edge journalist at the end of the 19th century. Wells was the greatest champion of anti-lynching legislation in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, but she was also a suffragist. And she called the city of Chicago home. And there she was an organizer, a Republican Party operative, and someone who really understood that American politics has many facets, but one of them is the ground game. You cannot sit down and stay home on election day. And Mrs. Wells knew how to, again, get women registered. Remember, women start voting in Illinois in 1913, 7 years before the 19th Amendment. So you've got to get them registered. You've got to get them to the polls. You've got to get them to those party conventions and meetings, and get them weighing in on the selection of candidates and the crafting of platforms. And the lesson from the example of Ida Wells is this: there is no excuse for for passing up on rolling up your sleeves in an election cycle. If you care about politics, if you care about the outcome, you have to do that work. And however, when you get the microphone or the pen or the platform, the podium, you speak about your best ideals, your highest ideals. So when Mrs. Wells got to the podium, she didn't moan about, the lousy weather in Chicago in November, though certainly she faced that. She didn't spend too much time, decrying the anti-Black racism that confronted her and the women in her suffrage clubs. What she did was remind us that when we talk about voting rights, we are talking about democracy. When we talk about voting rights, we are talking about human rights, right? When she got the microphone, she lifted up our sights to our best ideals. And I do think even in the 21st century, it can be hard to do both, right? We can be on social media and talking about big ideas, or we feel really immersed in the trenches of the get out the vote. But the example, I think, from Mrs. Wells and many of the women in Vanguard is that American politics require that we do both, and we learn to do both all the time. And so I'll leave folks with that idea.
I think that's a great example, and also very powerful in giving a speech or giving a persuasive argument, is to pulling it back to these big ideals and what we stand for. And that's right. How we kind of push forward and don't lose sight of the goal at the end. So that's actually a really good lesson for when any of us are trying to figure out how we're going to deliver a persuasive argument too. So Bonnie went to Bryn Mawr College, and she wanted to know what's your suggestion for other universities that are trying to grapple with a complete history and a more inclusive history, and how to engage in that effort? And Bonnie, I knew I loved you in our classes. That's right down the street from me, Bryn Mawr College. And you can see this, you literally can see it in their signage, and just kind of how they're, trying to figure out how do you tell the complete story.
Well, thank you for that. And Bonnie, I invite you to visit our website at Hard Histories at Hopkins to take a deep dive into some of what we're doing. The first thing is courage, which is to say, I believe, that history is an essential and powerful force for our present and for our future. And that means that I am someone who tries to be unafraid of confronting myths, even when they are dearly held and widely repeated. So I think there is an element of courage, and finding a community of courage among your colleagues at Bryn Mawr, as I have done at Johns Hopkins, has been essential. I think it's important to link the work you do on your campus to the work that's happening around you. So it is true in Baltimore, and I imagine it is true in the greater Philadelphia area, that you are not the only institution that is engaged in a kind of reckoning with the past. In Baltimore, that includes our daily newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, which just a couple of weeks ago issued a public apology for its long role in promoting anti-Black racism in Baltimore City. The Walters Art Museum, one of our fine arts institutions, that is reckoning with the role that its founding family played in the Confederacy and in segregation in Baltimore City. The Clifton Mansion, which is one of our good old historic sites where Johns Hopkins once made his home, is now refashioning their tours to incorporate the roles that enslaved people played at Clifton in the years before slavery's abolition. So we are trying to stitch ourselves into a broader community. And when we do that, I think it changes people's minds about the significance of the work, which is to say, we're not here to tear down or to vilify an individual. We're here to be part of a broad, deep, and very necessary rethinking of the past and how we tell it. So you need allies and partners, I think, to do the work well. And then I think you just have to be meticulous about the research, right? And that's not hard on a great campus and a great institution like Bryn Mawr, but we have to really maintain and hold up and honor the standards by which we work as historical researchers, not compromise, not be drawn into other ways of narrating the past. We have to stick to, I think, our very important professional experience and standards and more, so that we get it a little more right this time. And I wish you all the best with it. I really do.
That is a fantastic way to kind of pull us in together to understand that you started with us, that history is everywhere. You can look in your own home and begin to do that research, but there are standards to doing that great historic work, and we should explore those to ensure that we're doing the job of a great historian and being well-rounded. I also just love how you layered in that history and civics are important at so many different levels, and all of those experiences are important, from the education to civic engagement to engaging in the civic commons. You talked about that in the past, that people came together at the table to engage in civic conversations, that we're doing it in the square, and that we're doing it in this community too. So it's so important to have dialogue and have a civic commons and engage in the practice of history and really understanding pieces that we may be missing, but also pieces that need to be told. So thank you so much. That was a fantastic class. It gave us both theory, practice, 19th Amendment, American history, the whole shebang. So thank you so much for coming back to class with us. And Jeff, I'll turn it back to you to do the wrap up.
Well, just to say, here, and thank you, Professor Jones. Time with you is always special. It is meaningful. And we always learn and are inspired to learn more. So thank you for inspiring all of us, and can't wait for the next time we're lucky enough to talk with you.
Thank you all so much. It's always a pleasure to be here, and shout out to all those students and educators on the line.
Great. Thanks to everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thank you everybody so much. And we'll send out your homework list from Professor Jones.
Absolutely. Enjoy all that wonderful reading. Thank you.
We love homework. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.